Let's talk about how your diet interaction with your microbiome could possibly impact the antibiotics you are taking. Could your diet promote antibiotic resistance? And what is antibiotic resistance? Well, we're going to dive into that in the research that we cover today. But in short, it is, we've used so many antibiotics over the last few decades that bugs are starting to become resistant to them, to the point where certain scientists are sounding the alarm that we may be approaching what's called an antibiotic winter, which is a fancy term for a situation where we would run out of antibiotics that that bugs aren't resistant to. So essentially, we wouldn't have any useful antibiotics. So we don't want to run into that situation because the bugs aren't going away. So let's dive into the research and see how our diet could impact our microbiome and how the impact on our microbiome of our diet could positively or negatively impact how well antibiotics we take work. So we'll start our journey with this paper out of Nature. And the title is Microbiome Diet Interactions Drive Antibiotic Efficacy. And let's start down here. Let me get my pointer for you. So this paragraph here says, the microbiome provides a rich genetic pool encoding enzymes and biochemical pathways that offer additional metabolic, physiologic, and protective functions to the host encoded by the host genome. So it's a lot of scientific nerdy terms saying that your gut microbiome, made up of your probiotics, which are the good bugs, made up of commensal bugs, which could be good or bad depending on surveillance and peer pressure. The microbiome provides lots of resources in addition to what our body provides for things like immune defense, for digestion, etc. And that microbiome, as we've talked about before, the probiotics are fed by what are called prebiotics. And prebiotics are the fibers in our diet. And the fibers feed the probiotics, and then the health of the probiotics helps impact our health. So if we jump to this quote here, or this part of the paper here, it says, high-fat, low-fiber diets, which are increasingly consumed worldwide, have a significant impact on microbiota composition, metabolome, and diversity. Low-fiber diets lacking complex polysaccharides impair the protective barrier functions conferred by the microbiota against pathogens. So high-fat, low-fiber diets would be considered fast food. Okay, so we're not talking about high good fats here. We're not talking about, say, a hunter-gatherer diet or even a carnivore or ketogenic diet made up of grass-fed meats and healthy fats. We're talking more like the standard American diet. That's a high-fat, high-processed fat, omega-6 oils and things like that, canola oil, trans fats, those types of high fats, and low fiber. So that standard American diet, which, like they say, is increasingly consumed worldwide because we see a McDonald's in every country, right? We see fast food everywhere. So as this developed world diet is spreading, it has significant impact on our microbiome, and that can impact the barrier function here. So we've drawn before in previous videos. You can see this one layer of epithelial cells here. This is your gut barrier. So when you're reading blogs or you're watching videos on YouTube and the authors talk about quote unquote leaky gut, what they're talking about is you have this gut barrier here made up of one cell thick layer of epithelial cells. And this is outside your body here. This is inside the gut lumen, and this is inside your body. Okay. So these cells, this one cell thick layer is all that separates the outside from the inside. Okay. And so when you have leaky gut, there's a breakdown either between the cells or through the cells where more things than are appropriate get into the gut. And now behind this one cell thick layer wall, we have the immune system in an area called the lamina propria, and they're waiting to sound the fire alarm when things that shouldn't get through get through. Okay, so a high-fat diet promotes intestinal hyperpermeability or leaky gut and immune reactivity in various ways. Today, we're going to talk about the mechanism by which it does that is by impacting our microbiome and the metabolites that makes that should protect us. But when we lack that, it sets us up for failure. So a high-fat diet results in reduced antibiotic efficacy. This could not be explained by decrease in antibiotic activity, but rather by changes in the gut microbiome or microbiota, specifically reduction in Bacteroides and Akkermansia species. Okay, so let's break that down. A high-fat diet, so patients that were on a high-fat diet and took antibiotics did worse. They healed less. The antibiotics were less effective. How? Well, maybe the antibiotics didn't work as well. Oop. That's not true, because right here you can see it says this could not be explained by decreased antibiotic activity. So the antibiotics, quote unquote, worked the same in people on a high fiber diet, a healthy diet, and people on a high fat diet. The difference was the other things in the environment. Okay, so the antibiotic, quote unquote, had the same amount of activity, right? They did the work they were supposed to, but their effectiveness was less in the high fiber diet. Well, why? Good question. High fiber diets, okay, the healthy type diets, result in the production of short chain fatty acids, secondary bile acids, and quorum sensing molecules, which are important for multiple microbiota functions, including protection against pathogen invasion. Okay, so when we eat fiber, our probiotics, or the good bugs in our microbiome, they will ferment those fibers, that prebiotic food, okay? And from that food, they produce short chain fatty acids like butyrate, like propionate, like acetate, okay? And they also will utilize secondary bile acids and produce quorum sensing molecules to help set up a healthy microbiota. When we're not, and in so doing, the gut microbiota produces indolacetic acid. That's what IAA is. They produce that when there's a high fiber diet. And that IAA, or that indolacetic acid, acts synergistically with bactericidal antibiotic treatment by increasing pathogen metabolic activity, hereby avoiding the formation of persister cells. Okay, and the formation of persister cells lead to antibiotic resistance. So when we're eating a high fiber diet, we're feeding our probiotics, our healthy microbiota. Those healthy microbiota are going to take the fiber, and they're going to take tryptophan from our food, and they're going to produce indolacetic acid with it, or IAA. And the IAA acts synergistically with the antibiotics to increase pathogen metabolic activity. Well, why would that be important? Okay, when you have an infection, the way that antibiotics work is they bank on the infection, in this case the bacterial infection, the bacterial cells being metabolically active. They're going through their metabolism, they're taking up things from the environment and ingesting it. Well, we want them to ingest the antibiotic, right? We deliver the antibiotic to the scene, and a metabolically active bacterium will take that up, and essentially its metabolism will end up its undoing because it takes up the antibiotic, which kills it. Well, check this out up here. Microbial cells with reduced metabolism and slow or no observable growth are called persister cells. And you might remember in previous videos where we talked about biofilms. And I'll link to a biofilm video here, but over on the right here, I'll draw it again for you. A biofilm is kind of like an igloo that bacteria produce to hide from our immune system and hide from our testing methodologies. Okay, so you could picture it in here at this lowest level. This is a group of persister cells. They're hiding in the base of the igloo. All right, and each of these layers is protection. So when you send an antibiotic down, you might knock off a few shingles, but you're not going to get to the persister cells. All right. Well, research states that up to 80% of infections include biofilms. So in the classic biofilm pattern of infection is, say you have a UTI, you take an antibiotic and the UTI symptoms go away. But then you stop the antibiotic and 2 weeks or a month later, you have UTI symptoms again. And you take the same antibiotic again and it works again, so to speak. And 2 weeks, a month later, it's back, okay? That is a classic pattern of biofilm infection. Essentially what's happening there is you take the antibiotic and the antibiotic knocks off enough shingles from the roof of the biofilm to make you asymptomatic. Then you stop the antibiotic, your 10-day course is over, right? And these persister cells here in the bottom that are dormant, they wake up and now they're swimming in the guts of all their buddies, right? The ones that you killed. Well, that's very nutritious for them. So now they wake up and they have some nutrition and they rebuild the biofilm. They've patched the roof to a symptomatic level and now, quote unquote, your infection's back. All right. So unless you get to these persister cells and kill them, you're going to consistently have this biofilm-based infectious pattern. Okay. Well, so persisters are what we need to take care of if we want antibiotics, if we want to be successful in eliminating the infection. Well, persisters pose a great clinical concern since their dormancy dampens antibiotic modes of action that rely on several cellular activities, resulting in these cells becoming highly tolerant to antibiotics. So again, the persister cells are essentially dormant or sleeping, so they're not highly metabolically active. So when you put those antibiotics in, they don't kill the persisters because the persisters aren't taking them up. So we need those bacterial cells to be metabolically active to have the best treatment effect of the antibiotics. So how do we do that? Well, we want our microbiome to be able to produce things that drive bacterial metabolism and activity. Well, one of the things that a healthy microbiome makes or produces from a healthy high fiber diet is the IAA, or the indole 3-acetic acid. So when you're on a healthy high fiber diet, you're making that IAA promotes bacterial activity, so they stay active, they take up the antibiotics, and the antibiotic treatment is more successful. If you're on a high fat diet, then you see here, the IAA was significantly reduced in the high fat diet. In the gut, IAA is derived from tryptophan present in dietary proteins and can be produced by several Bacteroides species, the same species to be decreased in the high fat diet. Okay, so if you're not eating the high fiber diet and sufficient protein, you're not going to produce the IAA, and that leads to reduction in bacterial metabolic activity. So down here it says, in the absence of IAA, MRSA has reduced metabolic activity, potentially explaining the lower antibiotic effectiveness observed in the mice fed the high-fat diet. So we want a high-fiber diet so that you're making enough IAA so that these MRSA cells, the pathogens, are metabolically active enough to be impacted by the antibiotics. So the authors conclude with indole acetic acid could potentially be used to stimulate bacterial metabolism in combination with antibiotics to avoid the dormant persister cells and effectively fight the pathogen burden. This study highlights the effects that lifestyle factors can have on the microbiome and demonstrate that microbiota functional capabilities are critical for the fight against infections. A highly diverse microbial community, which can be modulated by the diet, has an intrinsic capacity to act as a protective barrier against infectious invasion and expansion in the gut. So this paper is a great example of how the right diet can promote gut health and immune health and the microbiome role in that, and the wrong diet can have the opposite effect, and not just on our own intrinsic immune response, but also on the extrinsic impact of things like antibiotics that we're taking to help ourselves successfully clear the infection faster. So that's one paper that's important. The next one here we can see is also from Nature, and it's titled High Fat Diet Increases the Severity of Giardia Infection in Association with Low-Grade Inflammation and Gut Microbiota Dysbiosis. So again, high fat diet is the culprit here, and Giardia infection is a very common parasite. Giardia is the parasite that's associated with what's called traveler's diarrhea. If you've ever gone to Cancun, or the Caribbean, and you accidentally on the last morning brush your teeth with the water out of the faucet and end up with diarrhea, that's probably Giardia. Okay, that's traveler's diarrhea, and it's spread by oral fecal route, okay, or contaminated food or water. So this paper is showing that when you have a Giardia infection, and let me just state that you don't have to go to Mexico or a third world country to get Giardia. It's quite common in the US. I see patients with it frequently. And so this is relevant to everybody because everybody is exposed to it. Okay. So Giardia infection, say you have a Giardia infection. Well, a high fat diet makes the infection worse. Okay. Well, how? Good question. Let's dive in here. High fat diet mice with Giardia exhibited more mucosal infiltration by inflammatory cells, decreased villus to crypt ratios, goblet cell hyperplasia, mucus disruption, increased gut motility, which is diarrhea, and elevated fecal water content. So the high fat diet and Giardia mice had worse inflammation in the GI, worse gut barrier outcomes. All right. The gut microbiota analysis revealed that the high-fat diet alone induces a shift in the microbiome. Okay, so like our paper said over here, high-fat diet changes the microbiome. You can see it in this graphic. Well, here's another paper saying that even regardless of the Giardia infection, what's going on, just the high-fat diet alone shifts the microbiome in a way that's disadvantageous. So these findings suggest that a high-fat diet exacerbates the outcome of Giardia infection, right? You're adding layers to the same case. And just say you have a high-fat diet alone with no Giardia infection, you've already got an imbalanced microbiome, moved away from a healthy, from what a healthy microbiome should look like. Now you add Giardia to it, and of course, the Giardia infectious outcome is likely to be worse because you entered the infection with a worse microbiome than is optimal. And we saw over here how a suboptimal microbiome makes it harder to clear infection. Okay. Now, is there risk? Could the diet also increase autoimmune risk? Great question. Here's the third study. Detection of alterations in the gut microbiota and intestinal permeability in patients with Hashimoto's thyroiditis. So here's thyroid autoimmunity being studied against the gut microbiome and leaky gut, so to speak. So the first thing I want to look at in this study is this highlight right here. It says the microbiota modulation by diet directly influences the inflammation profile due to the generated microbiota metabolites and their direct or indirect action on immune cells in the gut. So again, here's another paper saying that diet directly influences gut inflammation and the microbiome impact on the immune cells. Okay, so if that's the wrong diet, a poor diet that is leading to negative inflammatory outcomes and microbiota outcomes, then we have negative immune outcomes. And those immune outcomes can lead to autoimmune disease. And that does occur in Hashimoto's and Hashimoto's is the most common autoimmune disease worldwide. Okay, so these authors observed observed the gut dysbiosis, the microbiome shift towards a disadvantageous phenotype, and they also detected increased zonulin concentrations in patients with Hashimoto's, which zonulin is a marker for intestinal permeability or suggesting hyperpermeability or leaky gut. So when you're reading blogs or watching videos or movies that talk about leaky gut or the gut is the cause of everything, that's multifactorial, and that's a little bit of a simplification, but oftentimes the gut is involved because of that's where it's kind of the node point where the immune system meets the barrier system, which separates the outside of you from the inside of you, which also meets the microbiome. Okay. And then also that's where foods hit, right? And that's where how most things enter your body. So the gut is very important because that's where the immune system is, that's where the microbiome is, and that's the access point for most things in the body. So if we want to be healthy, we have to optimize that area, and doing that means optimizing your diet, which will help you optimize your microbiome, which will help you optimize your mucosal barrier defenses and your immune system. So a healthy diet made up of good, healthy fats. Again, I want to stress that fat is not the enemy here. People hear high fat diet and get scared of all fat, but you have to read in context and realize that all fats are not created the same, just like all carbohydrates are not created the same. A high fat diet, the high fat diet that is studied is the standard American diet, the canola oils, vegetable oils, pro-inflammatory omega-6 oils, trans fats, those types of foods. They're not studying grass-fed meats, okay? They're not studying CLA and good fats, okay? It's the bad fats. So don't fear the good fats. Don't fear the high-quality olive oils and the coconut oils and the omega-3.
Is there anything that would cause people not to be able to digest fat very well? Like the good fats that would create this problem the same? Like, I mean, I don't know that it would be the same, because even if you're eating high quality fats but can't digest it, does it create the same bad microbiome?
Well, not necessarily the microbiome, but if if the human host isn't digesting the fats, then you may not be as healthy as you could be, right? So the mechanism involved there would be your gallbladder and your bile acid levels, because bile acids emulsify the fats or break them down. Your lipase levels from your pancreas, your brush border enzymes, which these little finger-like projections on the epithelial cells of the gut, those fingers are called the brush border, and they produce brush border enzymes that help break down carbs, proteins, and fats to the smallest level. That's the last step. Excuse me. So if you're referring to poor human host digestion of fats, then yes, that can impact the host negatively. But if you're eating good fats, you're supplying the microbiome. You just may not be digesting and absorbing them thoroughly enough for yourself. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah.
So then it would be looking at gallbladder, looking at bile acid levels, looking at is the pancreas producing enough lipase? Is the brush border intact and producing enough digestive enzymes there?
Okay. Thanks.
So good question.
I have a question. So the keto diet and the carnivore diet are notoriously lower in fiber, but some people do well on them. Would you be suggesting that those diets aren't, would have the same effect as, the hamburger and pizza diet in your picture?
Yeah. So good question. So if we use a carnivore diet as an example, it appears to be notoriously lower in fiber, and it is in plant fiber. But if you're eating a nose to tail carnivore diet, then you're including connective tissues and the connective tissues is actually the carnivore fiber. And so there's been studies where they look at the microbiome and the impact of eliminating the plant fiber and just getting the connective tissue or the carnivore meat fiber. And what happens is they see a shift in the microbiome of species that metabolize plant fiber to one that metabolize the meat fiber, we'll call it. But there's no evidence that it's a negative health consequence to the patient. So there's the total shift of the microbiome, which is expected because you go from feeding plant fiber bugs what they get to not getting it, and then not feed. Before you weren't feeding the meat fiber bug stuff, and now you are. So you're going to see a shift in the dominance profile, but you still have the microbiome there. So they haven't shown that that's a negative health consequence. You're just favoring different bugs.